Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey-Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, September 1st, and I don't know when this happened. We're going to hear the presentation, 2023 Ethics Roundup. All right, so if you have any technical questions during today's presentation, type them in that Q&A box, and I will do my best to help you with those tech questions. For content questions related to the presentation, go ahead and type those also in the Q&A box. We will either get to them incrementally as we go along, if it has to do with a specific scenario, or if it's a more general question, we'll get to those at the end. I would like to say, if you have a super specific ethics question that involves context and just a lot, I might suggest that you reach out to the AICP Ethics Commission directly versus using this forum, just because we can't take a whole lot of time, but I will still filter through all those questions no matter what anyway, and we'll make sure that you get your answer in one way or another. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible. And today we're sponsored by the Minnesota chapter of APA, which is where today's speaker hails from. So thanks to all participating APA chapters and divisions and to APA Minnesota. And this screen is totally wrong. You can type in, instead of the sustainability and resilience, this is good for your required ethics credit. So 1 ethics credit, you can get that, or you can get 1.5 regular general CM credits. And you can do that by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account. From there, you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which will be found on our webcast website, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. We're also going to have the session available on demand as well. If you are on social media, be sure to like and follow us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, and a reminder of what's on tap for Friday. And we record all of our sessions. We post them onto our YouTube channel. So head over there, type in Planning Webcast, and we'll pop up, along with our well over 400 session recordings, all available to you for free. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you get notified when another session is up and ready for you to view. So that's it for my housekeeping items. Again, if you have any type of questions, get them in that Q&A box, and we will get to all of them in some form or fashion. And also, just beware, we are using Mentimeter today. It's an online platform to do polling type things. So this is an active session, and we hope that you'll participate versus just kind of sitting while you're eating your lunch. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erin Perdue. Let me stop sharing my screen. Can't do 2 things at once here. Okay, you can go ahead. Perfect. And Erin Perdue, you go ahead, take it away, introduce yourself, and let's get started.
All right. Thank you, Christine. And I'm assuming that Christine will let me know if I'm having any technical difficulties and I'm like either not heard or not seen, or we had an issue with my webcam earlier where it looked like I was being dubbed. My face did not match the sounds that were coming out of my mouth. So hopefully we've avoided that. Yeah, my name is Erin Perdue. I am the chair of the AICP Ethics Committee, and I'm excited to be with you on this Friday midday session on ethics cases of the year from 2023. I appreciate you joining me on this day before a holiday weekend. I'll try to make it as interesting and fun as I can, although there's some meaty material here too that you should know. This presentation is a joint effort by the Ethics Committee of the American Institute of Certified Planners, and I've edited it a little bit to suit our purposes today and our time frame today. Let's see here. Okay, so as Christine mentioned, we are going to be using Mentimeter for some polling questions along the way related to each scenario that I'm going to present today. If you want to use the QR code on your screen or go to the website menti.com and enter the code for our session today, it will help if you can do that ahead of time so that you're ready to answer questions as we get to them. You can either do it on your computer or you can do it on your phone or tablet, mobile device, whatever. It's very easy to use, and we'll show the polling results live. And I think Christine also put the information in the chat so that you can access it anytime.
I did.
Great, thank you. All right, so a little bit about me. I mentioned that I'm the chair of the Ethics Committee. I'm also a member of the AICP Commission from Region 4, and Region 4 is generally the Midwest and Upper Midwest region. So it covers Minnesota, where I am sitting, and Ohio, where this webcast is being hosted from, as well as other Midwest states. My day job is as a planning group leader for Stantec. I live and work in Minneapolis, so I'm coming to you today from my home office in Minneapolis. And I will caveat by saying that I live downtown. You can see from outside that I'm right downtown. I also live very close to the hospital, so I get a lot of ambulances going by. Even though I'm pretty high up, you can still sometimes hear them, so I'll apologize in advance if we get. If you hear sirens, don't worry, it's a common thing here. That's my contact information on the screen. If you have follow-up questions or things that you'd like to discuss with me, feel free to reach out anytime. I'm also going to give you the contact information later in this presentation for the AICP Ethics Officer, and he is a wonderful resource for any sorts of just general questions, informal inquiries, or anything that you want to bounce off him. So I would highly encourage you to use him as a resource as well. Okay, so what we're going to cover today is just a basic refresher on planning ethics. This is something that is required for you to get your CM credit for ethics. And then we're going to go into some ethical scenarios. We have one that will probably take up a lion's share of our time, which is a sexual harassment case that you may or may not have heard of a little bit already. We have a couple of conflict of interest scenarios, and then also one that involves politicians and planners and the interaction between those two. What I'm going to do is present each scenario. There are polling questions associated with each one, and then I'm going to pause to see if we have questions relating to that specific scenario. And we can address them right then. We will have time at the end for general Q&A or other issues that you want to bring up. So if you have those, I think Christine is going to be moderating all of that. So without further ado, I have to start all of these presentations with the legal disclaimer that we are providing general education regarding ethics, and these are meant to be illustrative. But only the ethics officer and the ethics committee are officially authorized to give formal advice on any potential ethical quandaries that you're facing. So again, if you have a question regarding any situation that you're in, please reach out to the AICP ethics officer. The phone number is on the screen, and the email is pretty easy to remember. It's ethics@planning.org. You can also find his contact information on the APA website. Okay, and just a quick reminder that if you need a reminder about the Code of Ethics, we have this handy ethics code certificate that you can download from planning.org/ethics, and keep it up in your office to remind yourself of both the principles to which we aspire and our rules of conduct. And I'll talk a little bit about those here in just a second. All right, so what I want to do first is to just remind you or let you know that the APA as an organization does have its own ethical principles in planning that it publishes as guidelines for all planners, advisors, advocates, and decision makers. So anybody who's involved in the planning process should follow and consult these ethical principles. So this goes beyond the AICP Code of Ethics. This is available to anyone that's involved in the planning process, and it could be a resource for you to use. As we know, all planners are involved in political situations of one type or another, work for city managers that may not be AICP, and so this is a handy tool to use in those situations. Basically, the ethical principles revolve around serving the public interest, maintaining high standards of integrity and proficiency, so kind of knowing what you're doing and acting with integrity, and improving planning competence, so making sure that we're all staying abreast of current trends and things that we need to know to be good planners. Now, getting more specific into the AICP Ethics Code that governs all AICP certified planners. There's a link on your screen to check out this should say planning.org/ethics. There's a link right there to the ethics code if you want to have it up and refer to it during our conversation today. The AICP code consists of 5 main components, and we're going to focus on the first 2 in this session. The aspirational principles, which are basically the shalls. These are things that we should be doing or must be doing in our practice as professional planners. Section B is the rules of conduct, and largely the rules of conduct say what we shall not do, things that are prohibited. And most ethics complaints that come up are related to people violating the rules of conduct. The last 3 sections relate to kind of how we administer the Code of Ethics, how we handle complaints, and what kinds of discipline we can hand out when there is found to be a violation of the Code of Ethics. There was a recent code revision in January of 2022, so it's been about 1.5 years now since the new code was adopted. And I'm going to highlight a couple of things for you that have changed recently with that code revision. Basically, the code tends to get updated every 5 to 7 years, I would say, depending on when it's determined to be needed, when there's a new issue that comes up that we need to edit or address. So these do happen somewhat regularly. All right, so these are the aspirational principles, as I mentioned, kind of the shoulds or the shalls for how we should conduct ourselves as planners. And basically, there are a lot of sub-bullets to these that you can read in the ethics code yourself. But the main headings are that we have to continuously pursue and faithfully pursue the public interest. So that means that we are not acting on behalf of any particular interest group or any particular politician that we serve. We are always looking out for the public. We have to do so with integrity. One of the aspirational principles that is somewhat new with this, it had been revised with this 2022 revision, is that we must work to achieve economic, social, and racial equity. And so that is one of the principles that we must work toward. I think this one is particularly important because as planners, I think sometimes we run into issues with this where we may be advocating for some sort of equitable policy that receives either public pushback or political pushback. And so it's good to know that we have this ethics code that we can fall back on and use as backing for our positions, that this is something that in our profession we are responsible to do. Even though we are not the decision makers, it's our job to work toward equitable outcomes. Of course, we are always safeguarding the public trust and improving planning knowledge with decision makers and with the general public. The rules of conduct, so the shall nots. There's a lot of content here, and I'm going to share some of these rules with you that relate to the particular scenarios that we'll discuss. But in general, these are the headings that the rules of conduct follow, and we are held accountable to these if we are AICP certified. There are rules of conduct regarding quality and integrity of the practice, conflict of interest, which comes up quite a lot, and some of our scenarios will talk about this, improper influence, honesty and fair dealings, our responsibility to our employers, which sometimes creates interesting juxtaposition with our code of ethics, our aspirational principles, and also our responsibility to deal with, serve the public interest. Those things are sometimes in conflict. Discrimination and harassment is an important one, and we will definitely get into that more during this session. And there are rules of conduct regarding bringing an ethics charge and cooperating with an ethics charge. There were some revisions to the code in 2022 regarding the adjudication of complaints. So when the ethics officer receives a complaint about an AICP planner that may have violated the code of ethics, there was a change to the rules that eliminates the ability of a non-AICP planner to contest the ruling of the ethics officer. The appeal process is very thorough, it is time-consuming, and a lot of times when complaints are raised by non-AICP planners, a good chunk of them are from members of the public who disagree with a planner's position on a particular development request, land use application, something like that. And so what we were trying to do here is minimize frivolous complaints and appeals when frivolous complaints are dismissed. It is to be noted that AICP planners can definitely file appeals. They can do so on behalf of a non-AICP planner. So if there is a real substantive issue they want to appeal, the avenue to do that is through an AICP planner. But this has greatly reduced our the time that our ethics officer spends adjudicating complaints that are really just sort of using the code in a NIMBY sort of way. Let's see here. Okay. And in addition to the code, which is not actually like adopted as part of the code, but it is a reference document, is the glossary. And part of the reason that we did a glossary was to help assist planners in understanding the language and intent of the code, particularly as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The language in the code often brings up questions about, you know, what do you mean by racial equity or equity in general, or harassment, or things like that. And so the glossary of terms is something that you can refer to for more detail if you're trying to interpret the words there and are unsure what we mean by something. One example is with regard to harassment. The language in the code talks about not tolerating acts of harassment. The glossary gets more specific in defining what kind of harassment are we talking about? What constitutes harassment? And so you can refer to that and find more detail there. So I would encourage anyone who's thinking about an ethical issue to remember that we do have that glossary as a resource. Okay, I don't know if before we get into the scenarios, I want to pause for a second and see if, Christine, there are any questions that I should be addressing just about the code in general.
Yes. There are a couple questions regarding where to find the very latest version, particularly with the updated glossary and information on the way in which the complaints are made and filed and all of that. It appears the latest one is from 2021 online.
I think that it says 2021 because I believe it was adopted in December of 2021 and published in January of 22. So that's the correct version. The one on planning.org. Okay. It's the right version. It was planning.org/ethics.
I'll
where
put that
you
in the
find-
chat or in the,
Yeah.
in the chat in case anyone
No, that's
wants
a
it.
great
So that is
question.
the latest ones. Okay.
It is.
I think that's it for the moment.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.
Then we will proceed with talking about our first scenario on sexual harassment. I'll preface this by saying that many of you may have heard about this case. It was pretty widely publicized in APA Interact. If any of you were at the national conference in April, you probably heard about this in APA General Communications. But during this session, I'm going to give you a little more specifics about the case and how it was adjudicated and what came out of it. All right, so of course, we sanitize this for consumption. There aren't any names published here that are real. But in this scenario, our planner is named Harry. He is an AICP planner who was a leader in his state APA chapter. Obviously, chapter leaders attend and host chapter events. They present at conferences and serve as mentors to planners within their chapter. One of Harry's mentees found his actions to be disturbing and complained of sexual harassment. This planner did actually speak directly with Harry, asked him to stop his actions, but the actions did not stop. This caused the mentee to start to withdraw from chapter activities, to not want to participate, not want to be involved with the chapter at all. This planner was not alone. There were other women who reported feeling uncomfortable and unsafe in Harry's presence. But they said nothing because, as I mentioned before, this was a chapter leader. Harry had a wide circle of influence within the chapter. Eventually, a witness to one of these incidents did actually reach out to our ethics officer and filed a complaint. The witness asked to remain anonymous, and so the witness's identity was kept private by the ethics officer who conducted an investigation. And so the ethics officer reached out to that witness, also spoke with other men and women who said that they were harassed by Harry. And again, I want to emphasize that all of those conversations were kept in strict confidence. So even the Ethics Committee, the AICP Commission as a whole, did not know who these witnesses or complainants were. After interviewing a lot of witnesses and reviewing evidence, the ethics officer did conclude that several instances of sexual harassment had taken place, either related to these chapter events or as part of chapter business. So the ethics officer found a violation. All right, I have a couple of polling questions for you now. This first one relates to the fact that the complaint was filed anonymously. And the question is Harry guilty of violating the Code of Ethics if the complaints were filed anonymously? Looks like we have over 400 participants here, so I'm gonna wait a couple minutes and let some more responses come in. I think we're seeing a pattern here. So yeah, most of you, the vast majority saying yes, it was a violation of ethics, even if the complaints were anonymous. Oh, right. And the correct answer and the answer from the finding is that yes, it is still a violation, even if the complaints were anonymous. So another question, and this is, I need to give you a little bit more information before you answer this one. But as I mentioned, Harry was a leader in the chapter. Other chapter leaders were knowledgeable about what was going on, you know, had witnessed the pattern of harassment, including the professional development officer and others in leadership. So the question is the PDO and others who may have witnessed the activity in chapter leadership, are they guilty of violating the code for failing to notify the ethics officer of these incidents? Would probably be a better word than charges here. Looks like we're sort of seeing the same pattern emerge that we did with the other question, although some of you aren't sure about this. So yes, the correct answer is yes, because, and I will show you the piece of the code that deals with this specifically. The answer is yes. If you fail to notify or bring charges against a violation that you see happening, you could be guilty too. So some of the ethical issues at play here, and that the ethics officer used when investigating the complaint. There are a couple principles to which we aspire that are relevant here. The first one is A1A, which talks about understanding our biases and privileges so that we can serve the public interest and promote a sense of belonging. There is another one, respecting the rights of all persons and not discriminating or harassing others. Obviously, that's directly relevant to this complaint. There are a couple of rules of conduct that the officer's investigation really narrowed in on here. The first one was rule number 6, which states that a certified planner shall not deliberately commit any wrongful act that reflects adversely on their professional fitness or the planning profession in general. The other one is rule number 20, which states that a certified planner shall not commit or ignore an act of discrimination or harassment. That one is particularly relevant to that last polling question where we asked, is the PDO guilty of, if they were aware of this harassment going on and didn't report it? Rule number 20 would dictate that and say, yes, if you are AICP certified, if you are aware of discrimination or harassment happening and you don't report it, that's a violation of the code also. So how did this end up in real life? The ethics officer, as I mentioned, determined that there was a violation of the ethics rule number 6, the one dealing with wrongful acts. At the time, Harry was not charged under rule number 20, that one that I just read you about, discrimination or harassment, because all of the incidents that were under investigation happened before the new code had gone into effect, which was January of 2022. So obviously rule number 20 would have been very relevant to this case. But since those acts occurred before then, our ethics officer relied on rule number 6, which was related to wrongful acts. The ethics officer issued a public letter of admonition, which is and recommended that the AICP and therefore the FAICP credential be revoked. And those two things together are really the most serious discipline that we can issue as an ethics committee. So the ethics officer told Harry that this was the discipline that was going to be issued, and when that happens, the planner has an opportunity to appeal. Harry did appeal that, the decision of the ethics officer, and when an appeal happens, that comes to the larger ethics committee itself. And so the ethics committee heard the appeal. Harry was able to provide evidence to the contrary, disputing the charges. Just so you're aware, Harry also had that same opportunity with the initial complaint. The complainant is made aware of the charges, given an opportunity to provide evidence and given an opportunity to speak with the ethics officer before a determination is made. So Harry gave us some evidence, did appeal the decision. The ethics committee voted to uphold the decision of the ethics officer, which was the public letter of admonition and revoking the credentials. And we also voted to publish the results in the APA online newsletter Interact. One of the duties of the ethics committee is to decide when discipline is issued, whether or not it be made public. In this case, there was a public letter of admonition that was issued, and we had the opportunity to decide how that was published and whether or not the name of the person in violation of the code would be published. In this case, the ethics committee has sole discretion over that. In this case, the ethics committee decided that it was important to publish the name of the planner who violated the code, Harry in this case, so that others would understand that that this was what the person was guilty of. A couple of just follow-up items before I pause and get to Q&A on this one is that, again, if the new code had been in effect when these charges were brought, item number 20, obviously, that says that we shall not commit or ignore an act of discrimination or harassment would have applied. We also have another new rule that states that we shall not harass or retaliate or threaten retaliation against a person who has filed a complaint. And in this case, there was some alleged retaliation, and so that would have been something that we could investigate also. And I'll point out one spot in the glossary that is useful here, which is, as I mentioned, we define harassment. And our definition of harassment is largely based on EEOC language that we adapted for our use because we are not a workplace, we're an association of planners. And we got some specific on what kind of harassment is covered in this language. APA, since this case, has really been spending a lot of time figuring out how we can handle harassment and specifically sexual harassment complaints better, and how we can try to prevent sexual harassment from happening at national events in the context of chapters, and of course with AICP certified planners. And so APA wants to make clear that we do not tolerate harassment of any type, including sexual harassment. It is a violation of the code to ignore an act of discrimination or harassment. So please keep that in mind. If you're an AICP planner, this is part of your responsibility. The ethics officer is always available to discuss possible complaints or give you advice if you're seeing something that you have questions about, or if you're a victim of harassment. We don't want members who feel victimized to deal with this alone. The ethics officer and the committee are resources for you if you have questions. And the APA has a pledge against sexual harassment. You all probably heard about this before the national conference in April, but we encourage all members to sign that pledge. We are also, the APA Board of Directors has a task force that is continuing work to figure out how we can enhance our processes for dealing with any complaints of harassment or discrimination APA-wide. The Ethics Committee, which I chair, has also reviewed our process for adjudicating ethical complaints and have suggested, and we are starting to work on some process improvements there, including things like how we handle confidentiality, how we can prevent or try to prevent retaliation, and how we can make the complaint process a little bit more transparent so people know what they're getting into. With all of this, we want our APA members to know that we're committed to confidentiality. So even in this case, names were not disclosed by the ethics officer. As I mentioned, the AICP committee, the AICP commission and the ethics committee did not know the identities of the victims or the witnesses, and were committed to conducting thorough investigations. I think, yeah, with that, I'm going to pause here for a second because I can imagine that there are probably some questions about this scenario.
Yes, a couple. The first one is, who determines who is and isn't published when their AICP is revoked? So in this particular instance, Harry was indeed called out for his actions pretty blatantly. Who decides when they are and aren't, and what is that threshold? Like, what are the metrics to determine that?
Right. Well, it starts with the initial determination of the ethics officer. So the ethics officer reviews the case, determines whether there's a violation, and then determines what discipline is appropriate. So it starts there, and that the ethics officer will issue a preliminary determination to the complainant. So to the the person who was alleged to have committed a violation. That's when the person has the opportunity to appeal before the discipline is actually made final. So in this case, the planner did appeal and was requesting, was claiming that he did not violate the code. That goes then to the ethics committee. The ethics committee has the specific responsibility to either uphold or change the recommendation of the ethics officer. And there is one piece of the code in the section on adjudicating complaints that says that the ethics committee, in its sole discretion, has the authority to decide whether names are published from the violators. And so there aren't any like specific criteria or like objective criteria there to determine whether a name is published. I can say in this case, some of the things that were discussed, and it was quite a difficult decision. It was not a unanimous decision by the committee, but we discussed, impacts on both the complainant, the victim, and impacts on Harry and his career and what that would mean. We also took into account what would be the value of making that information public to other planners. Like what value would it be for our membership to know that this person violated this particular aspect of the code? So I would say public letters of admonition and publication of the names of those who have been adjudicated is very rare. Usually there are private letters of admonition. If a credential is suspended for a short period of time, that's usually private. So it has to be pretty serious, and there has to be some value in letting the larger membership know that this person has committed a violation.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question regarding this case, and then we can move on. And it came up in one way or another, like 3 or 4 times. The people want to know if you're AICP and you witness harassment or you see it and ignore it, what are your implications? And is there a difference if the harassment that you're witnessing is being done by another AICP planner or a planner who's not AICP, or just anyone? Does it make a difference?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so if you are AICP and you witness harassment or discrimination, the general rule is that you have to make sure that that you take some action. Either let's say in the case of a certified planner, the action that you should take is a little bit more clear. You should contact the ethics officer, and probably I would say first talk to the victim that you witnessed to make sure that that's an okay thing to do. If it's not a certified planner, if you witness somebody, just in your daily work committing an act of discrimination, I would say that your responsibility is to intervene in some way, or make someone aware, someone in charge aware that there is potential harassment or discrimination happening. This could be a human resource issue, or I don't know what situation you might see. As far as being held accountable for ignoring an act of discrimination, that's a tricky one. I mean, in general, the ethics officer is not going out and proactively seeking to, adjudicate violators of the code. We act on complaints. So it's possible that someone might file a complaint saying that you, an AICP planner, knew there was a pattern of harassment and discrimination and you didn't do anything about it. It's possible. We haven't had that happen yet. And like I said, we don't proactively go out and try to seek people who have ignored the situation, but it definitely could happen. All right. So I think we're going to hold the rest of the Q&A then until the end. So I will move on here to, we have scenario 2 is broken up into 2. We have a couple of conflict of interest scenarios. These are shorter and sweeter than our other ones, so I think we can get through these more quickly. All right, but a lot of the informal inquiries we get relate to conflict of interest, and so that's why this is almost always one of the cases of the year. We like to share conflict of interest scenarios, and these are based on actual either cases or informal inquiries that we have gotten. All right, so in this case, Samuel, who is AICP, is a planning director for a smallish mid-sized city in a larger metro area. And his wife, Jerry, who's also AICP, works for a planning consulting firm, Planning Wizards. Anytown, which is the town where Samuel is the director, has published an RFP seeking consultants to complete a rewrite of their comprehensive plan. You can probably see where this is going. Okay. For some reason.
Good thing it didn't say restarting in like 2 minutes, because that's what happens to me.
No, it didn't, but somehow, hold on a second. Let me just, it's not letting me advance the slide. And I'm not sure why. Oh, it is saying it's my web browser is going to restart in 8 hours. Thanks for letting me know that. Okay, moving on. So the private firm that Samuel's wife works for, Planning Wizards, asked Jerry to develop a response to the RFP. 8 responses were received, and the town manager said Samuel is responsible for screening them down to 3 firms to interview. When Samuel reviews the RFPs, he realizes that one of them has been submitted by his wife's firm, and his wife is actually the lead planner on the project. In reality, Samuel was probably already aware of this because husband and wives talk about things, but that's neither here nor there. So he's uncertain about how he should proceed. So how do you think Samuel should proceed? We have a couple of different possible responses here. Recuse himself from the RFP review, participate in the review, but not evaluate Planning Wizards' proposal, or not sure. Okay. Pretty overwhelming response that I'm seeing here. So a follow-up question. Is it a violation of the Code of Ethics for Samuel to review the RFPs? There's a little bit of a difference between this one and the last one. It's like, well, should you do it? Should you not do it? Or is it actually a violation of the code? Yeah, this one's a little bit more nuanced. Interesting. So it's kind of about half and half between yes and either no or not sure. Which, yes, as I said, this is a little bit more of a nuanced question. Okay. Well, I'll let you know what the, well, first of all, a couple of the aspirational principles that would apply here. Overall, the principle that we should safeguard the public trust. And so we need to guard against influence by personal relationships, avoiding even the appearance of a conflict of interest, disclosing to the public all personal and pecuniary interests, and not deliberately committing a wrongful act, which reflects negatively on the planning process. Again, there are a few rules of conduct that apply here too. So these are the shall nots. We have a responsibility not to accept work if there's a possibility for direct personal or financial gain to us, to our family, without full disclosure. We cannot engage in private communications if we have authority to make a final determination. And we also have a responsibility to be honest and fair in our dealings. So not disclosing our advantage or any confidential information. So given all of that, before I get to the real life, what happened, what options are ethical? And you can choose more than one here. So the first option is that Jerry, the wife, puts together a team and submits the RFP, and Samuel is included in the review team. Or Jerry submits the application and Samuel recuses himself from review. The other option is that Jerry could recuse herself from the team and just let her firm submit a proposal without her. Or her firm just does not submit a proposal. Okay. So kind of a rough consensus that the first option is not ethical, but some combination of the other three might be. Excellent. All right. I'm going to share with you this was an inquiry for informal advice, and I'll let you know what the ethics officer had to say about this. So the ethics officer recommended, first of all, that the private firm, Planning Wizards, should contact the planning department and ask them how to resolve the situation. Either by contacting Samuel and asking him to recuse himself from the review. So that would be one way to resolve this conflict of interest. Planning Wizards could remove Jerry from the team. Or both parties should provide full written disclosure of this conflict. So really, I think your responses to the polling question were right on, that some combination of either having Samuel step back from the review or have Jerry step back from being on a team would be the best way to resolve this conflict. Disclosure is always the best. If there's even any question about something being a conflict of interest, disclosure is always a good idea. Disclosure doesn't necessarily resolve the conflict though, so that should be combined with one of those other two options. Were there any questions about this scenario or issues that you want to discuss?
I think you can keep going.
Okay. Continuing, then here's another conflict of interest scenario, again, involving a private firm and a public agency. So in this case, Dorothy is the planning consultant. Well, she's currently a public sector planner for Mayville, and she is leaving her position to join Planning Magicians, a consulting firm. And she signed a letter of employment to make that happen. Before she signed that letter, during her interview with Planning Magicians, the firm told her that there was a pending RFP from Mayville for a new zoning ordinance. And Dorothy was not involved in this RFP at all, but she is, of course, aware of the issues that the town is facing because she was a principal planner there. So she has some idea of what approaches might be acceptable to the community. So this was happening during her interview process. Planning Magicians would like Dorothy to be a senior member of the team for that zoning ordinance project. Because of that, the firm's principals have asked her to review and comment on the draft RFP response that Planning Magicians is making while she is still employed by the city of Mayville. So she's given her notice, but she's still an employee of the city. So a few key facts here, as I mentioned, Dorothy is leaving in 30 days, but she's still an employee of the city. She doesn't start her new job for another 30 days. The RFP response is due in 30 days. So she can't wait until after she leaves and she's now employed with her new employer to deal with this. And the city does not have a revolving door policy against working for a jurisdiction that you just left. So that means she could take a job with this planning firm and she could work on this project if her new firm was hired for the job. So a couple questions about this one. Is it ethical for Dorothy to assist Planning Magicians with their RFP to the city, with their response to the RFP to the city of Mayville, before she moves firms? Okay. Pretty clear responses on this one. So next, what principles to which we aspire should Dorothy consider? Anything dealing with conflict of interest, or none, because Mayville doesn't have a revolving door policy, so the ethical principles don't apply. Okay, pretty clear consensus on this one as well. So the aspirational principles here, yes, are all of the ones that deal with conflict of interest and safeguarding the public trust. So again, some of these that we just talked about in the last scenario about disclosure, about not using personal relationships, allowing that to influence any official action, things like that. We also have rules of conduct, again, relating to conflict of interest, relating to abuse of your position and private communications, and being honest and fair in the dealings, in your dealings. And so, one last question here, and I realize this is a lot to read, so I'll narrate these. What options are ethical? You can choose multiple. Have no contact with Planning Magicians about the RFP. So this is for Dorothy while she is in this transition period and still employed by the city. Have no contact with her new firm about the RFP. Take personal time to help Planning Magicians with the RFP, but not do it on company time. Answer all of the questions they have and work on any other projects after the 30 days. Refer any of those RFP questions that Planning Magicians has to other planners in her department, and work on any Planning Magician projects except Mayville after the 30 days when she actually officially becomes a Planning Magician employee. Looks like the top three are having no contact with her new firm about the RFP, referring questions about it to another planner so she stays out of it, and work on any projects except for this one when she joins her new employer. So the actual advice that was given was that the ethics officer recommended, as always, full disclosure, and that she look closely at Rule 13, so that she should discuss the matter with her supervisor at the city. She should not discuss the RFP with Planning Magicians while she is still employed by Mayville. So she really needs to kind of stay out of this. And the ethics officer further advised her to fully divulge this conflict to Mayville's RFP review team. So again, full disclosure to both parties, and best to just stay out of the RFP review and answering questions for her new employer. So your responses were pretty good there. Were there any questions about this scenario?
No, you are free to move on.
Okay, I think, Christine, given
Oh,
that—
wait, I did find one. I
You
did find one.
one.
A
Okay.
couple, yeah. All right. Is it possible that she would be violating procurement laws or policies of the city by reviewing their RFP? Is that right?
Yeah, completely. It's
Okay.
completely possible, yes.
Okay. All right. Why, this is a clarification question on this one. Why is Dorothy working on projects without actually being employed by them yet? The ethical challenge would change if Dorothy was employed by both at the same time.
Right. Yeah, she shouldn't be. And I don't think the intent was I don't believe she actually was working on projects, but what they're asking her to do is sort of like starting to work on this RFP response while she's still employed with the city. So I don't believe she was actually working on projects yet. But if she was, that would sort of be a potential violation of like moonlighting without disclosing that to your employer.
And is there a certain amount of time when you're in the public sector before jumping over to private planning work? Is there a point where you can start to share information?
Yeah, the ethics code doesn't provide a specific like buffer period, but a lot of public employers do in their own policies, and private employers do too. You know, if you jump to another firm, you may have a non-compete or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah, and you do have an ethical obligation to follow the policies that your employer has, but the ethics code itself doesn't get that specific.
Okay. That question actually came up twice now.
Okay.
Is there a violation that should be lodged against planning wizards for asking them to undertake work that seems unethical?
That's a good question. I mean, it certainly could be. Now, there's no rule. The rules here are a little bit different than the rules about harassment. You know, we have a specific rule about ignoring acts of harassment. But in this case, we don't have a specific rule about ignoring conflicts of interest. Like if a third party witnessed this and thought, you know, this is kind of icky, there isn't a rule that you have to report that. But yeah, it's possible that a violation could be lodged against if there's an AICP certified planner at the consulting firm and they're asking a public employee to do something that's a conflict. Yeah.
Okay, that's it for now.
I think, given that I know you like to leave a half an hour for like open discussion, I think we could probably do that. I can skip the last scenario, and if we have time for it before 1:30, I'll go through it. But if we have just general discussion that we want to have, should we do that? Make sure
we can. There are quite a few questions going back to the ethics case regarding harassment.
okay.
But I wanted to try to scoot maybe off of that for a minute and just look at some of the other questions.
Sure.
One of them is more logistic. Is there a policy to review and revise internal policies on a regular basis in terms of like the AICP Commission? That, you know, every 6 months we look at XYZ and then the next year we look at ABC, anything like that?
Yeah, generally no, there's not a regular interval that we do that kind of stuff. We do it as issues come up, as it's necessary. The only thing that AICP does that does kind of roll on a regular schedule is updates to the AICP exam. We do those on a, minor updates every 2 years and major updates, I think every 4 or 5 years. But otherwise, we don't have a schedule for reviewing our policies. But, certainly when things come up like the sexual harassment complaint, that spurred us to really take a hard look at our processes and see where we can do better.
Okay, this is a good question. Planners working with advocacy organizations, how are planners expected to behave when their organization's view of the public does not consider the disproportionate impacts to racial groups when the state outcome is for the broad public? So I guess how I'm interpreting this is essentially a planner works for an organization that doesn't support the values of AICP, and how do they function around that?
Yeah, that is a question that we're actually, as a ethics committee, we're looking at trying to provide some training and some guidance on this, because this is the classic scenario of we're trying to follow the code of ethics and our employer doesn't value that. Our employer wants us to do something contrary to the code of ethics, right? I sort of hinted at this at the beginning of the session. And often it does come down to, yes, public interest or equity, or usually it's those two things, right? So it could be, as this question said, if you're working for an advocacy organization that's not looking at the overall public interest, it's looking at a very narrow thing. But it also could be, as I mentioned, like you're working as a planner and your boss is the city manager and you're all responsible to an elected official who is trying to get you to do things that do not serve the public interest or do not follow racial equity. There's not a great answer to this question. I think as we discuss it as an ethics committee, we sort of come down on the side of as a planner, you are rarely in the position to make a final decision about something, right? Most of the time, we are advocating for something, we are making recommendations to another decision-making body. Ultimately, it's usually an elected body, right? So there's a certain point at which we have fulfilled our duty and then it's out of our hands. So, and it's a fine line that planners walk between, advocating for things that are consistent with our aspirational principles, but then realizing that we also have a responsibility to our employer. That's also in the code. So that's what I mentioned. These things are a little bit conflicting. And a planner has to decide, where to draw that line. That's a very difficult question. And I don't have a great answer, but it is something that we know planners need more guidance and more backing, I would say, to take a stand on these issues and act responsibly without assuming that every planner is going to, put their job in jeopardy for going out on a limb to advocate for a particular policy that's not popular. This is a really good question.
There's a lot of good questions, and I know a lot of them just might not have answers, and it's sort of,
right.
You just sort of have to amble through it and see.
Yeah.
This one is kind of interesting, and I'm going to add a little bit to the original question. So this one is, let's say you're a director of some kind and you're promoting, and you're AICP, and you're promoting someone that's maybe not AICP, and that they don't have the right credentials or academics and don't have the capacity or the experience, but for whatever reason, you're, moving them up into another position. And I'm going to add to that writing recommendation letters for people. When someone asks you to write a recommendation letter and you just kind of know that maybe they're not qualified or experienced, or maybe if you were asked to be a reference for someone who's getting a planning job and you just trying to be nice, is there anything in the code of ethics that you should be looking at before you make some of these calls?
Hmm. That's interesting. I haven't been asked that question before. Um, our ethics officer probably has. I would say that there isn't anything in the code that deals with whether or not you should write a letter of recommendation for somebody, even if you think they're not quite the best person for the job. I don't think there's anything in there that comes to mind that would prohibit you from doing that. But the more specific situation of, you're a director and you're promoting somebody who's perhaps not AICP, but you don't think is really qualified to do the work. That's interesting. And I guess I would wonder, like, what is the compelling reason to do that? You probably shouldn't do that, just in general. But the code language says that we as AICP planners should not take work that we are not qualified for. It doesn't say technically that you shouldn't delegate work to people who are not qualified to do that work. Although I might make the leap and say, strictly, you probably aren't in violation of the code, but you really shouldn't do that. It's just, you're one step removed from being in violation of the code. So this is kind of icky. Yeah.
I like that. It's icky.
Yeah.
All right. This next one is going back a little bit to one of the other questions. When you are working for a community that doesn't share the same values, it's a very specific example, which just frosts my cookies. And the question is, what do you do when you're asked to write exclusionary zoning text? And as you are the main keeper of the ordinance, you are the one who is entrusted to keep it updated and make changes, and you are being asked to do things that are a detriment to the community.
Yeah,
right?
That's
It's not
really
like you can
hard.
just pick up and say, I'm done here. Not
Right.
everyone can do
yeah,
that.
maybe you could. In an ideal world, maybe that's what you would do. But I realize that, I've been asked this many times, particularly for planners who are in states that, aren't really necessarily aligning with their values, and thinking to themselves, well, I can't just pick up and leave the state altogether. What am I supposed to do? My response is always, again, that there's not like a super clear, rigid, here's exactly what you should do. I think you should do your best. You shouldn't just write the exclusionary language that someone asks you to write because you have a responsibility to your employer. I think your responsibility is to at least explain why this is not good planning practice. It is contrary to what good planning is, and explain, what you would recommend instead. And then if you're overruled, you have to do what you have to do. That's sort of, it's not a great solution, but that's sort of where I and other members of the ethics committee have sort of landed on this. It's not satisfying to say, well, at some point you just have to do what you're told. We don't like that, but.
Next question. We're going to go back to Harry for a minute.
All right, let's do it.
And from my understanding, after he was stripped of his credential, or maybe perhaps during, he was either asked to resign from his position or he was let go. Can ever the reverse be? So, for example, if you have someone who is AICP and something unrelated to planning, perhaps, or adjacent planning happens, perhaps another credential of this person might get revoked, like, civil engineering or something, or I don't know, they find themselves in prison, or can that just be like an automatic trigger to lose your AICP, or does it have to be in relation to a complaint related to the Code of Ethics?
Yeah. I would say no, there's not an automatic trigger like that. For example, you get arrested and you're convicted of something, a felony. There, even then, there's not a trigger for automatically losing your AICP. I will say though that the ethics officer can file complaints based on things that like public information that the ethics officer is aware of. So if something like that happened and the ethics officer was made aware of it and it did have something to do with the code, then the ethics officer could pursue discipline without somebody actually calling them and complaining. So that's possible.
General question regarding AICP. I'm sure you look to some of our allied organizations for what their ethics principles are and how they're laid out, and the mechanics of filing a complaint and all of that. How does the commission interact with other organizations? And is that true that you do kind of do homework and maybe swap ideas, or is this just solely what's come out of APA?
Yeah, no, we definitely do collaborate with allied organizations. Our the APA CEO is always looking at procedures from other, architecture, landscape architecture, engineering, city, county management, that sort of thing. Specifically with regard to ethics, especially lately, as we've started to look at our own policies and figure out what changes we can and should make. We've definitely looked at how other organizations handle things like anonymous complaints, or how they manage keeping things confidential while still needing to conduct an investigation, right? Because obviously, if the ethics officer is aware of a potential violation, they have to investigate it. They're going to have to disclose some names and interview some people and gather some evidence to figure out whether it happened or not. So we're dealing with issues of confidentiality and privacy and anonymity, and we have looked at best practices for those things. And there are some very good guidance out there. We've also been, one of the things also that came out of this sexual harassment case is trying to figure out whether there is a better way that for intake of complaints, or for us to be a resource for potential victims of harassment. We're looking at maybe some type of ombudsperson model where we have, right now our ethics officer is a white male, and it's been brought to our attention that, perhaps we need to have some, gender, racial, age diversity in the people that can take complaints, because not everybody is comfortable, calling up and talking about this kind of sensitive stuff with our ethics officer. It's a complicated situation, and so we're looking at other models for how we might be able to do that. So yeah, I would say yes, we definitely look to other allied professions for help with these things. As far as the ethics principles and the principles to which we aspire, those are pretty unique to planning. If you read them, they kind of sound unique to our work. But definitely our procedures and policies and our stance on harassment is something that crosses professions, and we are definitely looking at how we can do things better.
Okay. So clarification, a non-AICP planner, if they want to file a complaint against someone, they need to do so through another AICP planner?
No.
Okay.
And a non-AICP planner can file a complaint against an AICP planner. You can file a complaint. What a non-AICP planner cannot do is file an appeal. So if a non-AICP planner files a complaint, the ethics officer investigates and recommends dismissal of the complaint. That non-AICP planner cannot file an appeal. They would need an AICP planner to file an appeal on their behalf.
Okay. Why is that?
So again, it was not to take away completely the opportunity for a non-AICP person to bring a complaint, but we were trying to get rid of the frivolous complaints that we get from members of the public who are really, they feel that there was something wrong with the action on a planning decision. So it's not really related to a planner and whether they violated the code of ethics. It was, they didn't like the recommendation of the planner, or they didn't like their decision on a particular application or something like that. We get a lot of those. And so we were trying to cut off appeals and have an AICP planner advocate for it if it was really something legitimate.
Okay. Hey, can Harry ever be reinstated?
I don't think so. I mean, the way the letter was worded was that his credential was not suspended, it was revoked. So I mean, I suppose if it was, in Harry's case, this isn't going to come up because the individual is nearing retirement and doesn't want to, you know, become a member of the organization again. But I suppose if it were a younger person and enough time had passed, they could go through the entire certification process again. But given that the credential was revoked, I'd say probably not.
Okay. How do planners, AICP planners, deal with members either of the public or appointed elected officials that are harassing staff? So it's not necessarily, obviously the public or, elected officials, they're not AICP. So it's not like you could turn them into the ethics commission. But if you're seeing that your fellow planners are being harassed, I mean, is that just an HR thing? Or is there really anything that the commission can do?
That's really kind of an organizational thing. This happens all the time, that like city staff gets harassed by elected officials who feel like the elected officials feel like the staff is not doing their bidding, right? I mean, this happens all the time, not just to planners, but to other professionals. And so that's sort of a city manager issue. That's why they get paid the big bucks. Not something that the association really gets into. Unless
there were quite a few questions about Harry and whether he can come back from this.
I don't think so.
Okay. Right. He's done.
He's done.
There are quite a few questions asking where the letters are regarding the actual Harry. Are they still public?
They are public on so they were published in an APA Interact, and they are in, I'm just going to go to the website and see. Exactly.
I tried to look and I found just a brief article from APA, but that's all I found. I didn't find.
That so I don't want to spend my time on here. Thinking, so you found the blog post.
I did.
Yeah, it doesn't. And
I didn't see any links to it.
Yeah, I don't think the letter was actually published, but it is public. Okay. So if you would like to read the actual letter that was issued, you can reach out to the ethics officer at ethics@planning.org and he will send it to you.
Okay.
It's the description in the blog is the only thing I think that's on the website.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We have 5 more minutes. Can you do 2-minute go at the last scenario, or at least introduce what the scenario is?
Of course. Yeah.
Since we have just a few more moments.
Of course. Yeah, let me bring this back and share my screen again. Sorry, juggling my windows.
Right.
Okay. All right, let me get this into present mode. That was the one we just discussed. Okay, so the last one, since we have a few extra minutes, is about politicians and planners, and it's a quick one. So kind of gets at some of our questions, actually. So Jane is a public sector planner in Jacobsville, and she staffs the Planning Commission, and the planning commissioners are appointed by the mayor. One of the members of the Planning Commission asks Jane to host a series of public meetings on her behalf. And we're not sure what those meetings were about when the commissioner asked. But soon after, Jane learns that the commissioner is running for, or plans to run for, a seat on town council. So the request may have had something to do with that. Do you think Jane is guilty of violating the Code of Ethics if she arranges the meetings for the planning commissioner? Yeah, it's sort of a strange question. I don't know if I've never been put in that situation, but I guess it doesn't mean it couldn't happen. But the majority do not think she's guilty, or are unsure if she's guilty of violating the code. So again, our aspirational principles about lean towards thinking about interrelatedness of decisions and consequences, and always keeping the public interest in mind. And then, so the real life outcome here was that the ethics officer suggested, again, always erring on the side of disclosure. The ethics officer said, well, you should notify your supervisor before you schedule these meetings. But he did agree, the ethics officer agreed that there wasn't a potential violation of the code for doing that. So I think the answers to the polling question were pretty right on, that it's not a violation of the code, it's just sort of weird. So it was good that she reached out, but not actually a violation. Yeah, so I think we've been talking about further discussion, and I'll just leave this slide up on the screen if there are any other questions we need to wrap up with. Again, any kind of informal advice regarding conduct, Ralph Wilmer is our ethics officer. His phone number and email are on the screen. You can also find his contact information and the form for filing a complaint at planning.org/ethics. And we've got our 8 members of the ethics committee, including me, on the screen too. So you know who these folks are. If you happen to know any of these people, you can always reach out to them too.
Wonderful. This is a good question that came in at the last moment. So good.
Okay.
And I think you did touch on this, but let's highlight it. If you're not AICP, but you're a planner, maybe you're not even an APA member, can you still call Ralph?
Yes. Yes. Ralph is a resource for any planners. He does not check whether your membership dues are up to date. So yes, you can definitely call Ralph.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. Let's wrap it up here. Couple reminders. The CM number is now up on our website, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast, so that you can log those credits. And we are recording this. We'll post it up on our YouTube channel. Head over there, subscribe to us so that you can check out all of our other recordings. And we have a new session, or a new batch of sessions. I'm calling it like my fall series. They're coming up here shortly. We're going to start advertising those so that you can register for them. So we've got a great lineup. And I think that's all I have. Thanks to the Minnesota chapter, thanks to the AICP Ethics Committee, and of course to you, Erin, for joining us today. Everyone have a great weekend. Enjoy the Labor Day holiday, and we'll talk next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.